so I'm pretty sure it's rather clear why I like Sonic so much by now. It's all I've been talking about on my channel lately, spending what you could describe as a lot more time than necessary discussing this series. I don't hold a positive opinion of every game I've talked about, but the ones I like, I really do. In no case was that stronger than Sonic Adventure 2. You know, that one game I basically made a feature film on because I may or may not have a couple screws loose. TLDR if this is your first video of mine or you otherwise just missed it. I thought SA2 was the pinnacle of this long-running series. Others are welcome to see it differently, of course, but to me, no other game in this series represents the franchise's raw spirit more than that one. It has the style, the substance, the willingness to push the needle of what can be done in the humble platforming genre, and so much more. It embodies this series' desire to expand and make a grand impression, which is something I have nothing but respect for. For me, it's more than just a fun game, it's an unforgettable experience. That being said though, while I definitely think the game was a huge success, the circumstances around it were more dicey for Sega and Sonic Team. They put their all into the game, but in the end, it only saw mediocre performance in terms of sales. This didn't necessarily have anything to do with the game itself, but rather the console was released for the Dreamcast. What had started off as a decent success, a system that would seemingly reinvigorate Sega's dying console business, had declined to the point the company had no choice but to jump ship from being a home console manufacturer entirely. If you ask me, it wasn't because of one particular reason, but what definitely didn't help was the announcement and release of the PlayStation 2, like I went over last time. That console was the direct numbered successor to the PS1, the then best-selling console of all time, and featured its own exciting next-gen graphics that were about on par with the Dreamcast anyway. On top of that, it doubled as a DVD player that cost way less than a dedicated one, and was even backwards compatible with the PS1, making the switch to it an easy decision for that system's already massive install base. With one simple trade-in at your local game store, you basically got a whole lot of next-gen games, a PS1, and a DVD player all in one. Meanwhile, the Dreamcast just had a bunch of arcade ports and played CDs, which I imagine many found relatively underwhelming. I don't mean to throw shade at the Dreamcast or anything, it's just that, with these circumstances, it's no wonder to me how it ended up losing so strongly to the PS2. In other words, it was the right console at the wrong time. Even though the Dreamcast didn't end up working out in the end, Sega wouldn't completely go out of business. Instead, they pivoted to the realm of software development, becoming just another third-party studio that made games for other companies' systems. Sega wanted to continue making games for their iconic flagship series, and were at a crossroad. They had to choose which console to bring the Hedgehog to, aiming for the smoothest transition possible. Ultimately, they picked Nintendo's then newest console, the Gamecube, because to them it made the most sense. Sonic would probably appeal the most to Nintendo players because of the series' bright, colorful aesthetics and characters that resonated with kids and teens. So Sonic made his debut on Nintendo with a port of SA2 to Gamecube, which managed to sell fairly well. That being said, Sega and Sonic Team soon realized they couldn't fully rely on the Gamecube alone. As you may be aware, it was the weakest selling console of the main three from its generation. Even Microsoft's Xbox, the first game console they ever made, managed to sell more than it. If they were to stick exclusively with Nintendo, Sega knew they would lose out on a ton of cumulative sales, especially with how the PS2 was dominating the industry. So they began development on what would become the first ever multi-platform entry in the Sonic series, Sonic Heroes. Right from the offset, I find this game one of the most fascinating in the series from multiple points of view. Maybe not quite as much as the adventure duo, but whenever I think of this series, it comes to mind right alongside them in many other of its games. That may seem odd for me to say, because in some ways this game does aim to return to the series' roots a little bit, or at the very least it attempts to be a bit simpler and more accessible for newcomers. If you ask me, that makes sense. Being the first true multiplat in the series, coming out on PS2, Xbox, and even Windows computers alongside the GameCube, it would without a doubt be many people's first exposure to Sonic, much like how SA2 Battle was for many Nintendo kids. The development team, once again led by director Takashi Iizuka and producer Yuji Naka, stated that they wanted to appeal to more than just Sonic fans, and so changed the series' direction from what the adventure games were doing. Not because they felt those games had anything inherently wrong with them, they just thought making SA3 would make new players think that they were missing out, so doing something simpler would make it easier for them to jump in. Despite this back-to-basics approach, however, Sonic Team didn't just aim to do exactly what the old Genesis games had done, except 3D, and designed the gameplay around a particular idea they had. Don't worry, I'll get to it in a second. In one sense, I can see why this may have disappointed or alienated some longtime fans. And even I must admit, it's a bit of a shame we would never get a Sonic Adventure 3. I thought they were on a roll with those games, managing to establish many great ideas in SA1 that were refined in the sequel. A third game could have brought those concepts even further, cleaning up whatever shortcomings still existed. In another sense though, I'm not one to immediately shoot something down because it's different from what I prefer, and I'm willing to play ball with the developers' ideas. After all, if every single game from a series is basically the same thing, I don't know, that would get tiresome after a while if you ask me. I wouldn't say that developers on a long-running series should necessarily do whatever random crap they want. I'd still like it if the series' core elements and appeal are generally kept intact. I mean that if the devs want to experiment a bit or try new things, I honestly don't see anything wrong with that. I would definitely say Sonic Heroes is a prominent case of this. as opposed to the Adventure Duo, which were both more or less based on the same general fundamentals and gameplay concepts. Heroes attempts something different. If you're wondering what that is, well, it's all in the game's title. This game expands the playable cast considerably, having double the amount of characters the previous games did. But despite that, it only has one gameplay style. These 12 characters are divided into 4 teams of 3, and you play as these groups of characters in their own scenario. Of course, it's more complex than that, but that's the basic gist. The development process for this game was rough, to say the least. Now, that wasn't really anything new for this series. It suffered from troubled production cycles since very early on in its life. But the case of Sonic Heroes was particularly notable in this regard. It experienced heavy crunch, since Sega pushed hard to get it out as quickly as they could. They also switched to Criterion Software's Renderware engine, a pretty popular graphics API for the era, rather than the custom one they had been using for the last few games, to make cross-platform development easier. But in the end, I imagine it only added more fuel to the fire, obviously due to inexperience. Izuka, who was not only the director but also a designer, even lost over 20 pounds and developed insomnia after another designer for the game got too sick to continue working. Safe to say, it's a bit of a miracle that this game came out at all. Although speaking of, when it did come out, the game's reception was notably more mixed than previous entries. Whereas the Genesis and Adventure games got pretty high scores overall, Heroes was more so in the 6 to 7 out of 10 range. From what I can tell, this game was generally more polarizing than the previous games were at the time. As the other 3 Sonic games have continually become increasingly more divisive over the years, Heroes has experienced a similar divergence. Although this effect wasn't quite as pronounced in its case because, again, the game was pretty much always a love it or hate it since it was released. So enough about what others think, that's of no concern to me. You want to know what I think about this game. I assume you do anyway. Well, I spoiled that rotten in the title, so much for the suspense, I guess. It's not quite that cut and dry, though. My personal story with this particular entry in the series is far more complicated than the rest. I first played Sonic Heroes sometime around late 2019. My family was well aware of my obsession, hobby of collecting retro games, and I said that Heroes was a game I wanted. Lo and behold, I get a Gamecube copy of the game for that year for Christmas. Very nice of them to do, although it's a player's choice copy with the ugly yellow spine that Nintendo decided was a good idea to have for some reason. And good God, why the hell are replacement cases so expensive? I mean, Christ, do they think I'm a money printing machine or something? In any case, I never really made it that far into the game. I beat a couple teams playing it on and off, but never really committed to reaching the true final boss until a little less than 2 years ago, when I did my original video on the game. If you've seen it, which please don't if you haven't, you'd already know what my opinion on this game was after my first exposure to it. I could tell that story now, but I think it's best saved for later on. I've already padded this intro out enough already. Without further ado, it's Sonic Heroes time. Although before I get into the game proper, I should note that I'm playing the Gamecube version, albeit emulated through Dolphin. Either way, I was going to play that version, because if you ask me, it's the best one. I've made the different versions of these games a pretty consistent topic of discussion in these videos, since they often make significant changes. In the case of Sonic Heroes, and most Sonic games going forward for that matter, the differences are relatively minor. I also own this game on Xbox, but that version is pretty much the same as the Gamecube one, except it's missing some effects and has a somewhat more inconsistent frame rate. On PS2 though, you can tell Sonic Team was inexperienced with the hardware, since it's capped at 30 FPS, chugs frequently, and has no progressive scan option, among other things. Also, while there is a Windows version I could have used, I've heard that version also has some real issues and glitches of its own. So I just went with the Gamecube version, as I said, emulated with Dolphin so I could get widescreen. In my experience, it has the occasional stutter, certain spots like this one area in Bullet Station, and the credits, for some reason, experience significant frame drops. And there was at least one of these annoying warnings about invalid reads I had to click ignore on, but that was pretty much it. I was willing to put up with these minor issues for the sake of playing my pick for the best version of Sonic Heroes, except in widescreen. So, with that established, Sonic Heroes is a pretty stark change from the last few games right from the start. The other ones began with over-the-top intros that sought to give you a taste of what cool stuff the game had in store. Heroes still does this, but its opening cinematic is noticeably more upbeat, almost like a cartoon or something. It focuses less so on giving you a sampling of action-packed set pieces, and more on the team and character aspect. That's not to say it's completely devoid of any of the series' trademark action and style, though. Around the midpoint, there's this really sweet shot of Sonic and friends grinding through a huge airship armada, created by Eggman, as it blows up and crumbles to pieces. After this is an ominous scene with a dark figure, which I have absolutely no idea of who that could be. Cue all the game's teams coming together with a shot of the game's logo. Like Sonic Adventure 2, it's this really cool, thematically appropriate design that I quite like. Those 3 colored spheres represent the main trio, similar to how SA2's logo had elements of Sonic and Shadow's color schemes. Unfortunately, I can't really say the same thing about the box art itself. I'm not sure who decided that Yuji Uekawa's stylish artwork should be replaced by these dated CG renders, but whatever the reason may be, I don't prefer it. It's the same reason I don't really like SADX's box art when you compare it to the original. Uekawa's art just aged better if you ask me. Anyway, enough about that stuff, let's start the game already. The title screen is pretty similar to SA1 if you ask me, with the whole cloudy sky theming it has going on, but just different enough to stand out. It's a shame that the widescreen gecko code I use for the game reveals the edges of the screen and breaks the illusion though. It makes sense that it happens, the game is designed around 4x3, so showing the rest of it would naturally cause issues like this, and I just see it as the price to pay for widescreen, but it's still a bit distracting. Actually, come to think of it, SA2's HD port occasionally had issues with this, and shows animation details that were originally hidden from view. I didn't comment on it in that video because, well, it was already long enough already, but also because that kind of stuff doesn't really bother me much. In Heroes, though, it's that way with the 2D HUD elements, which I find more noticeable. I don't know, it's probably just me. I'm rambling at this point. Upon selecting a new file, which you actually get 99 of, by the way, you're brought to a very familiar looking menu screen. You can choose from any of the 4 teams the game has, made up of Team Sonic, Team Dark, Team Rose, and Team Chaotix. According to that annoying son of a bitch Omochao, who makes a return for some reason, because everyone wanted him back, as well as the game's manual, the teams act as a sort of difficulty selection. Team Rose is the easy mode, Team Sonic is the medium or normal difficulty, Team Dark is the hard mode, and Team Chaotix, well, they don't really fit into that mold. They're more so a special mission mode of sorts. If you're a newcomer to the game, I would obviously recommend Team Rose first, but since Team Sonic is the first one listed and probably what most consider the primary playthrough, that's where I started. So, Sonic Heroes, or more specifically the Team Sonic campaign, opens up on a CG cutscene. Like with the HD version of SA2, these pre-rendered scenes are still in 4x3 for obvious reasons, which kinda sucks, but what can you do? Sonic is seen running around, I don't know, looks like New Mexico or something. Tails and Knuckles, flying in the Tornado 2, catch up with him, and hand the Hedgehog a note. It's from Eggman, and he's planning to conquer the world yet again. I mean, are you surprised? He's developed a revolutionary new weapon that will supposedly allow him to complete his conquest within a mere 3 days. Sensing another adventure coming on, Sonic and friends group up and start to give chase after the Doctor, as Tails and Knuckles abandon the plane willy-nilly. I imagine it has an automatic landing mode, but I'd like to think they just let it crash and forgot about it, because that's funnier. Weirdly enough, Knuckles doesn't seem to be guarding the Master Emerald at the moment, for the simple reason that he's not on Angel Island anymore. I'll admit that is a little jarring after several games where it was established how serious he takes that job, but honestly, I don't mind that much. They probably just got tired of writing the Master Emerald and the island into each game's plot, and if you ask me, nothing in this game really outright says he doesn't guard the island anymore, so sure, I'm not too bothered by this. Anyway, even though it's only in a dated CG form right now, I have to mention how much of a step up the general presentation is from the previous games, which unfortunately suffered from awkward line reads, a lack of lip syncing, weird dialogue pacing, and stiff animations to varying degrees. SA2 was a giant leap forward in this regard in my opinion, but it still had the thing where characters cut each other off, the music was mixed too loud by default, and the motion capture could look odd sometimes. Sonic Heroes takes the next step after that, and features lip movements that more or less match what the characters are saying as far as I can tell. And I honestly think the actors sound more natural than they ever have. Ryan Drummond and Scott Dreyer absolutely kill it as Sonic and Knuckles respectively, and I find they're acting even more confident than their already solid performances from the previous game. I can say the same thing about the other returning actors, including Jennifer Dooley as Amy, David Humphrey as Shadow, who yes is back again, I'll get to it later, John St. John, who by the way also voiced Duke Nukem as Big the Cat, and of course Dean Bristow as Eggman, and so on, as well as most new actors. However, there is one notable exception to this, that being,
it's not an Eggman robot.
Yeah, that. No offense to William Corkery, the actor for Tails, but I don't really care for the direction they gave him. To me, Tails sounds a bit too young and nasally in this game, which can get a bit annoying. Although to be fair, I'd say Tails' voice could always be a little grating sometimes, namely in SA1. Also, I find some of Charmy's line deliveries annoying, but beyond that, Sonic Heroes has decent voice acting in my opinion. And the actors once again managed to fit their characters quite well. Seriously though, I absolutely love the Dreamcast era cast. Wait, what just happened? These actors and actresses are these characters for me, and they're the voices I hear whenever I envision them. In Sonic Heroes, I find that especially worth noting, because this game has the most characters in it out of any game in the series so far, and really emphasizes their dynamics, since, again, they're all running around in teams of 3 and interacting with one another. Perhaps even a little too much, because as you may know, Sonic Heroes is the first game in the series to feature in-level conversations. At multiple points throughout the stage, the characters will comment on what's going on around them, or about the reason they're chasing Dr. Eggman. I don't mind this, to be honest, because for the most part I don't think it's all that intrusive and serves as charming character development for each team. The only problem then is,
look at all those Eggman robots! Look at all those Eggman robots! Look at all those Eggman robots! Look at all those Eggman robots!
which I'd say kind of speaks for itself. I wouldn't be surprised if less tolerant folks would have more of an issue with that. Some sort of dialogue frequency toggle would have been nice, because even I'll admit the more frequently repeated lines can get a bit bothersome. Although, speaking of team dynamics, the gameplay is based around them. It could be argued that this game is a return to what the Genesis games were doing, except in 3D. In fact, many reviewers at the time seemed to praise the game for doing so. In several ways, I'd say there is a kernel of truth to this, and it's all because of how the game is structured overall. As opposed to the adventure duo, whose multiple characters or character pairs had their own gameplay style, Heroes scales it back. The series was already kind of on this path to begin with in its 3D entries. Sonic Adventure had 6 gameplay styles, which if you ask me was maybe a bit excessive. In my eyes, some of them ended up rather shallow and boring, while others could have used more dev time to reach their full potential. In Sonic Adventure 2, this was reduced to just 3 main styles, which I'd say was the right call. Having less extraneous mechanics such as Big the Cat's fishing left more time to fine-tune the elements they felt were necessary, which I thought led to an overall more satisfying experience. Now granted, it certainly helps that the gameplay styles they brought back were my 3 favorites from SI1, and that I find their gameplay fun anyway, and don't mind the style switching and all that stuff, but even with that in mind, I think there's something to be said about knowing your limits. Sonic Heroes, as a game that wanted to ease players into the series, went for the simpler approach to be easier to pick up and play. The idea being that, upon selecting a new file, the player could pick whichever team they wanted and play through their story without feeling like they're missing out on something from the others. Rather than featuring frequent cutscenes and story beats that the stages were based around, the levels are more or less disconnected from each other, apart from the relatively simple plot of chasing down Eggman. These levels are all divided into pairs, each of which feature the same aesthetic as the other. After each level pair is a boss fight, whether with the Doctor and his robots or with another team. Sound familiar? Well, it should. That's the same general structure as the Genesis games, or more specifically Sonic 2 and onward. I don't find it hard to see why many critics at the time came to the conclusion they did, because there are multiple similarities between those games and this one. However, if you ask me, the similarities to the Genesis games are really only on a surface level, and I wouldn't say it's a robotic copy of what they were doing, but in 3D. I'll admit that this game is more similar to them, but to me, saying that alone is kind of underselling what it's going for. While it does have a simpler structure, Sonic Heroes is based around a unique concept, that of course being the 3-person team gameplay I've mentioned a couple times now. The game gives you control of 3 characters at a time, although not quite in the same way as Pikmin or whatever does. You still technically play as only one character at any given moment, and can switch between which one you're playing as with the push of the X and Y buttons, which is the equivalent of the Y and B button on an Xbox controller like I have. Each character has their own type, those being speed, power, and flight, and every team has one of each. Switching characters causes the group to assume a different formation named after its leader's type, and each of these formations give the characters a somewhat different moveset suitable for different things. Their moves slightly differ depending on what team you're playing as, but by and large they're essentially the same idea. The speed characters are quite fast, but harder to control because of their relatively low traction. The power formation is a little slower, but has greater traction, and is ideal for fighting enemies, because of the character's more effective combat options. And while the flight formation is the slowest, it also has the greatest traction, making it ideal for stage traversal, and can even attack from a greater distance than the others. Your goal is simply to reach the end of each stage, all the while knowing which moments are the best for each formation. These days, some often say they don't care for this 3-person team approach, and honestly, I get it. It can be a weird gameplay style to get the grips with, and I certainly attested not really getting it when I first played this game. That's because this game makes some odd changes to the overall Sonic formula that may seem downright bizarre. For one, the general controls of the speed formation, which most would probably stick to if I had to guess,
are honestly a noticeable downgrade from the previous games.
This is because of 2 things, the greater speed and more sensitive turning. On the whole, the velocity that the speed type characters can reach is the highest the series has ever seen. I've been praising the sense of speed and flow these games have been offering since the beginning, but I'd say Heroes is the quickest they've ever been. I find it rather impressive that they were able to pull this off so early on in the series 3D games, honestly, because it can be downright breakneck sometimes. Unfortunately, this also comes with the caveat of making the game harder to control. While the speed stages from the previous games could also be rather fast and require some practice to get the hang of, I'd say that effect is even stronger in the case of Sonic Heroes. What certainly doesn't help is Sonic's turning sensitivity. When you reached high speeds in the adventure duo, Sonic's turning became a bit slower as a way to prevent you from flying too far sideways when you tried to turn. In Heroes, by contrast, the speed characters still turn quite fast no matter what, which when combined with their faster top speed, can leave their general control feeling more slippery. Thankfully, the general button inputs for each aspect of the controls are pretty much the same, and moves such as the lightspeed dash are given to you from the start, but the physics are just different enough to the point you may have a hard time adjusting to them if you're used to how the previous games handled. I know I did anyway.
Certainly not helping matters is that there's still a mild case of same button syndrome, specifically with the light dash again.
On top of that, the way combat works has also seen quite a bit of change. Up to this point, combat in Sonic games was pretty simple. Much like most other platformers, enemies were pretty much obstacles that were easily dispatched in one hit. It was clear that the focus was entirely placed on the physics-based platforming and speedrunning appeal, and that the enemies were just an added flavor. The most complex it got was the bosses, but even those only took around 8 hits at most and were generally pretty easy. In Heroes, this has again been turned on its head, and the game goes for a more in-depth combat system. It introduces a new line of Eggman robots for the heroes to fight, the Egg Pawns. Side note, but I love the design of these things. They're modeled after the Doctor himself, and have appropriately goofy designs featuring the man's face. I don't know, I just find the idea of a gun beetle lookalike or a literal witch with Eggman's face on it, or what have you, an inherently entertaining idea. But to get back on track, these robots are quite a bit stronger than previous Badnik lines, such as the E-Series, or even Gun's police robots, in that they now sport health bars. Now it may take more than one hit to eliminate an enemy. You'll often hear that this makes combat a total pace breaker, which, like the slippery control, I understand. I'll admit that these changes were a bit arbitrary, and probably didn't need to be made. That said, while I fully understand why someone wouldn't enjoy the game because of these things, I can't really say they get in the way for me. To be totally honest with you, I really get a kick out of Sonic Heroes. Like I said earlier, it's not my personal preference on how to handle a Sonic game in 3D, but for what it is, I find that it offers a fun time in its own right. Maybe I'm just overly forgiving, but if I enjoy a game, I'm gonna be honest about that, and Sonic Heroes is a game I enjoy. For one, I honestly don't find the controls to be all that bad. Of course, control is a very subjective thing, so I can't really quantify it, but after learning to play this game, I got used to how it handled and can account for the more sensitive physics. What definitely helps is something I mentioned before but never really expanded on, the different formations. That was intentional because this aspect helps solve any control snafus if you ask me. I still wish the speed characters could have handled more smoothly, but if you use the other formations, I find it mitigates many of the more troublesome control issues. When a stage asks you to do more tricky platforming over bottomless pits, which is especially common later on, the flight formation is your best bet because of its more controllable airspeed, greater traction on the ground, and longer jump distance. Oh yeah, in this formation the characters can also, well, fly, which is useful for correcting jumps. Most of the time though, I end up playing as the power formation, because they have the best balance of speed and mobility. They're not too slippery, but can also run decently fast. And to be honest, they feel the most in line with how Sonic and Shadow handled in the adventure games to me. Although seeing Tails, Knuckles, or any other character besides speed types grinding on rails is quite cursed to say the least. Which reminds me, this game carries over the rail grinding mechanic that was introduced in SA2. It functions basically the same as it did there, with the whole crouching mechanic and leaning system and whatnot. However, I find that the system is a little broken by comparison. Maybe I just suck at balancing in this game, but I swear the character's leaning is way more sensitive, making it feel like a crapshoot whether or not you'll go faster by doing it. Oh well, I still think it looks really cool, and they added a new move to get a small burst of speed on demand by tapping the action button. Although rail switching seems even more glitchy than before it, and that weird thing where you'd go flying off the rail sometimes in SA2 seems to happen more often in this game. But enough about that, what was I talking about again? Ah yes, the team formations. I play as power most often because I find them to be the most general purpose, which also includes combat. The flight formation does have the Thundershoot move, which has the potential to be very destructive and even stuns enemies. And in some situations, the speed characters may have the homing attack enemy chains or blow the shields off enemies with their tornado move.
But for the most part, you'll want to use the power formation.
These characters have grounded punch attacks, as well as the option to use your other teammates as projectiles, which I find really funny. It's so over the top, I love it. In addition, some teams' power character also has a belly flop attack. These attacks make enemy smashing go by a lot quicker, which goes triple when you upgrade your characters. If you look at the character selection wheel at the top right, which by the way is designed to look like the game's logo, so that's cool, you'll see 3 dots on each character's picture. These form the basis of the level up system. Throughout each stage, you'll often come across item monitors with a colored sphere in them. These are power cores, and their color corresponds to whichever team member they enhance. Obviously, blue ones power up the speed character, red ones level up power, and yellow upgrades flight. And killing enemies often drops a random color power core. Picking up a few will fill in one of those dots in the character picture, indicating that you just leveled up. And believe you me, you'll want to do this, because holy hell the effects from doing this are just awesome if you ask me. The speed characters are relatively underpowered at their base level, but at level 3, their homing attack gets a wind effect, allowing them to blow off enemy shields and grab onto acrobat poles with nothing but a homing attack. Flight character's Thundershoot ability experiences an absolute glow up at max level, changing from a move that merely stuns enemies into a devastating weapon of mass destruction that can rip them apart from several yards away. Power characters are probably my favorite in this regard though. At the top level, their fireball attack becomes powerful enough to kill most enemies in one hit, and executing a 3-punch combo on the ground will make them unleash a powerful special attack. For example, Knuckles shoots out fireballs, while Vector spits napalm gumballs. Doing this is risky because the punch attack can potentially send you into a bottomless pit if you're not careful, but pulling it off properly allows you to deal out pretty strong blows to anyone that stands in your way. In doing this, I find that the combat doesn't slow down the pace. Is it ideal? No, I wouldn't say so. I honestly still prefer one-hit kill enemies because there's less margin for failure with them, but in Heroes, I don't know man, I find it really fun to gradually build up your level and then be able to trounce over all these enemies. When starting a new stage, you really have to think about combining formations to prevent combat from dragging on, such as stunning foes with a thunder shoot and finishing them off with fireballs. As your level increases, things gradually become faster as you can barrel through crowds with ease, and if all else fails, killing enemies and collecting rings will fill up an energy gauge at the top right. When full, you can initiate a team blast, which... yeah. Some teams also get an effect after they do their Team Blast. For example, Team Dark freezes enemies with Chaos Control, and Team Rose gets invincibility. I also love the animations for these things, like Team Chaotix is where they play music really badly and then the enemies die because of it. Man, this game just has so much charm and character, I love it. I'd recommend saving that for when you're really in a pinch though. I find this game's combat rather satisfying, although I will say the sound design is a bit weaker than last time around.
There are we? Yes, we are!
So that's a bit of a shame. Also, some of the more tanky enemies later on can be bothersome to deal with, but that's the worst I can say about it. I think it's decent fun, even if it may be a bit weird for a Sonic game. Another thing I really love about this game is the level design. In my opinion, it carries over the strengths of the previous games in spades, and in some ways, I may even consider it the best stage design in the series so far. No, seriously. Although I'm not totally sure about that, but at the very least, Heroes is a top contender for me. In fact, I honestly forgot just how much there was to love in these stages. Maybe they don't have the same number of epic shortcuts like an SA1, nor the tight laser-focused design with the occasional hidden goodies like an SA2, but I'd say they have strengths of their own. I think Chaotix put it best in describing Sonic Heroes as a puzzle game of sorts. At its very fundamental core, Sonic Heroes is all about picking the most applicable formation for whatever the current situation demands. Or you could say, you gotta bring the right tool for the job. For example, if there's a long stretch of land that can be safely traversed at high speeds or a trail of floating enemies, you'll want to bust out the speed formation. Same thing goes when there's two walls close together, which indicates you'll have to use the new triangle jump across the gap below. Whenever there's a large horde of enemies or a spot with somewhat more involved platforming, the power formation is your best bet. This is also true when there's floor fans somewhere, which you can use to ascend with the formation's triangle dive move, which basically replaces Knuckles' glide. If there's a section with more treacherous platforming above bottomless pits, or generally an area with tall platforms or narrow walkways, you'll want to switch to the flight formation. Again, it's all a matter of knowing when to use which formation, which is why I'd say calling this a puzzle game is quite apt. It may sound super complicated, but honestly, I don't think it is. For one, there's signs all over the place which sometimes outright tell you what the recommended formation is for their section to appear over. Even then, you're often able to go against the grain and get creative with which one you use. So in most cases, you shouldn't feel shackled into using any particular formation because the sign says to use it. Although if you're new to the game, that is what I would recommend doing. I find that using the formations effectively allows for a special type of flow that even the Genesis and Adventure games could only dream of. It's so much fun for me to rapidly switch formations, effortlessly stringing together moves from all three to achieve that same flow state a good Sonic game puts me in. Generally, this game seems to follow the Sonic 3 and Knuckles approach where levels are segregated into speed and platforming sections, as opposed to the more balanced design philosophy the Adventure duo went for. But like 3 and K, I find that this doesn't come at the cost of being able to master the stages and make them look like an absolute joke. Certainly helping with that is how the game never forgets about these formations. I'd say all three of them have their use cases, and I never stick to just one for the entirety of any stage, which to me is only further encouragement to think outside the box and get creative. Additionally, there's some more of those crazy, exciting set pieces the series has had for quite a long time now. And while I wouldn't say there's quite as many opportunities for it per capita as there were in the previous game, Sonic Heroes still has a fair amount of moments of that stylish flair to give you those oh-so-satisfying bonus points. However, I'd probably say Heroes' biggest triumph from the level design perspective is its integration of exploration and split pathways. This is an element I've been giving consistent props to the series for. Since its very first outing in 1991, Sonic games have always had their fair share of exploratory elements, which I've always found to be a nice touch to spice up otherwise fleshed out and polished stages. The hidden item boxes were an obvious one, rewarding players for thinking outside the box in an extrinsic way, but there was also the intrinsic satisfaction that came from using Sonic's moveset to pick the quickest pathways through each level. The stages were generally pretty tight in design, but had just the right amount of looseness to provide room for experimentation. The Genesis games were quite good at this, and I'd say the Adventure games especially excelled at it. Not sure if that's an unpopular opinion, but that's just how I feel about it. Honestly, Heroes may even be a step beyond that. Playing this game again for this video, I had forgotten just how many alternate routes and hidden items it has in its levels. I admittedly haven't played it in a while, but still, my point stands. What I think makes it all the more satisfying is how most paths paths that are reachable through creative use of your team formations. For example, a couple sections in Seaside Hill have these dash rings that you can jump into with the flight formation, which lands you on a higher ledge with hidden 1-ups and enemies that give you an opportunity to level up. Some levels also allow this with the tried and true physics manipulation series is said from the start. For instance, Grand Metropolis has a bunch of floating item boxes you can reach by jumping off a slope, and in other stages you can get on a higher path by using the new Rocket Excel move. That move is a bit finicky if you ask me, and I honestly much prefer the spin dash, which it replaced, but I find that if you can push past that barrier, it can be a handy move for quick traversal or even slope jumps. I find playing this game endlessly satisfying because, like the previous ones, it just keeps on giving when I do. Really, there's a whole bunch of stages I could point out that, in my opinion, do all these things well. Seaside Hill and Ocean Palace provide solid exploration as well as another iconic chase set piece, this time with huge spiked rocks. Frog Forest has a solid amount of hidden goodies such as 1-ups. Grand Metropolis and Power Plant have a fair few alternate routes to tighten up your run. Rail Canyon and Bullet Station feature a ton of rail grinding that asks you to be careful with your movements, as well as another neat train set piece that calls back the Hot Shelter, and so on and so forth. However, I would be remiss if I were to gloss over what was probably this game's ace in the hole as far as level design goes: Egg Fleet.
You fools must all have a death wish. Witness this invincible battleship built by the hands of a genius. Its power unmatched throughout the universe.
This stage is very reminiscent of Skydeck, except way better in my opinion. Whereas I've always thought that stage crumbled under the weight of its own overambition, Egg Fleet is one of my favorite Sonic levels. I find it fast, exciting, and feel that it has some of the most badass set pieces in the whole series. I mean, you're traveling between Eggman's huge airship armada, all the while you can see the clouds below, cluing you into how dangerous this place really is. It gives me the same tense feeling that Final Rush does, since one wrong move can and will lead to you falling to your doom. As with any of the most challenging Sonic stages, it's what makes it so gratifying to master. Sure, maybe it doesn't have as many hidden items as other levels in the game, but I honestly don't really mind, because, again, I more so see all that stuff as the cherry on top of stages I find enjoyable to begin with. As much as I've praised the exploration in this game because of how much I feel it adds to it, if those hidden items and split paths weren't there, I'd still enjoy myself quite a bit, because, again, I find these levels satisfying in their own right. It's those elements, then, which add extra spice to the experience. All that being said, though, this game does have some shortcomings. As much as I enjoy playing it, there's still a couple of things that I think could have been improved. It really comes down to two main things, honestly, those being the stage's length and how they're a little lacking in the polish department. This game features the longest stages in the series so far. Even at my level of experience with it, some levels can still last up to 10 minutes or more. Final Fortress is definitely the worst offender, and it's one of my lesser favorite stages in the game. I just think its immense length makes it a tedious level to go through, especially with how it packs all the game's most damaged spongy enemies into one giant endurance test. This is something that a lot of others take significant issue with, and I completely get it. It leaves me a bit shocked when I remember that they can go on for so long, because honestly, they sure don't feel that long when I'm actually playing through them. Such is the paradox of a fun game. I guess you can call it that. Even if the levels are mathematically longer than those of the previous games, with the amount of fun I have playing them, they honestly don't feel that much longer. So it doesn't drag down the pace for me personally. Still though, I think they probably should have toned it down a little bit in this respect to more easily accommodate newcomers. On top of this, the game is unfortunately less polished than its older brother in my experience. While sure, the adventure duo could also suffer from their own instances of early 3D platformer jank, I think Heroes has it the worst in this regard so far. Sometimes you may die in a way that just won't feel like your fault, whether it be overzealous knockback, getting flung off a rail when you try to switch between them at high speeds, getting hit during a scripted sequence, or some stage elements just not really working correctly, such as these pinball tables in Casino Park and Bingo Highway. Sometimes it can feel unpredictable, especially as a noob, and in many cases you kinda just have to know what to do to avoid the bullshit. Sonic games have admittedly had this issue to some degree since the start, but in my opinion, it was easily the most pronounced it had ever been up to that point in Heroes. It's because of this that I fully understand why some people really can't stand this game. Even as someone who's fully beaten the game twice and knows it fairly well, I still sometimes run into these shenanigans. I think the big sticking point is that this game needed some more time in the oven. Like I said before, it was heavily rushed, to the point Takashi Iizuka had trouble falling asleep, just like me, and suffered from unhealthy weight loss. I think it's fair to say that giving the dev team more time would have been nothing but positive. Sure, maybe the game would have had to have been delayed to the next year, but I think the benefit of better working conditions for the staff, which would likely have ultimately led to a more polished product anyway, outweighs the potential cons related to that. Truth be told, while everything I just said applies to all four teams to some extent, I think Team Sonic really embodies it as a whole. In my opinion, it's probably the best part of the game, not dissimilar to what I thought of Sonic's campaign in SI1. Most of the times I come back to this game, I'll end up just playing through Team Sonic again, and then pretty much call it a day there. In my eyes, it's the part of the game with the best balance of all the elements I praised above. I think the levels are a satisfactory length, even if maybe a bit too long near the end. There's a healthy amount of exciting set pieces, and the campaign has just the right amount of substance to keep me coming back. Also, while I don't think it's anything amazing, game, I'd still say the story of this game has plenty of entertainment value on its own. As I said earlier, it's pretty much a simple Heroes vs. Eggman plot with not much more to it than that. Eggman does have the Egg Fleet, that powerful weapon he mentioned at the start of the game, and there is this weird thing going on with, the doctor turning into liquid after you beat him. Alright then, whatever you say, Sonic. At its most basic level, the story of Sonic Heroes is rather simple beyond that. And like I've been saying, it's a game that more or less focuses on gameplay above all else. Whereas the adventure game's stories were written first, after which the levels and gameplay were structured around it, Heroes is the opposite. Its gameplay and levels were laid out, after which writer Shiro Maikawa filled in the blanks. To some, this may be a wholly welcome change, especially those who don't really dig it when the series has more complex plots. In my opinion though, I really liked those stories and felt they were the next step from the escalation the Genesis games had already gone through. It made those games more interesting and exciting for me. I've gone on and on about how this series was escalating with every game, so the fact Heroes doesn't really continue that trend, I guess it's a little bit, I don't want to say disappointing, maybe underwhelming. It seems to be more focused on maintaining the things those games built up, rather than taking them to the next level. Again, this game was made to ease newcomers into the series, so I imagine Sonic Team thought that dogpiling them with a bunch of lore would leave them confused or lost in some way. That being said though, while it may be a bit of a bummer, I can't really say I'm all that upset Sonic Heroes goes for a simpler idea. For one, while I like interesting stakes as much as the next guy, I don't need everything a long-running series does to be like that, especially in the case of something like Sonic, where the game's plots aren't really directly connected and there's not really a strongly ongoing, overarching narrative thread. I don't really mind if they want to make a breather episode every now and then. What definitely helps Heroes' case for me is its characterization and dialogue. Simply put, I think the characters were handled quite well and have a whole bunch of entertaining dialogue, interactions, and banter between each other. Some of it may be a little cheesy, like when Team Sonic, yeah, one who chose that name, calls themselves Sonic Heroes, but honestly, I don't really care about that. Above all else, Sonic Heroes feels genuine to me, much like the stories of the previous games. It doesn't strike me as cynical or anything like that. It feels like they wanted to continue developing the characters further, just in a simpler medium. And I also love how they show more characters than just Sonic, Tails, Knuckles, whatever, you know. Which reminds me, what I love the most about it is easily the dynamics between each team. If you ask me, each group of characters has something about them that makes their scenes really entertaining to watch. Team Sonic is about what you'd expect. Sonic, as the leader, encourages the others, but doesn't mind poking a little fun every now and then. Knuckles is once again the stern one of the bunch, but demonstrates that he's opened up and become more easygoing following the events of the previous game. And while I find Tails' voice kind of grating, he's involved with some pretty funny moments with the other two.
Maybe that's the ghost of Shadow we saw earlier.
Woo! Stop it, Knuckles!
Team Rose is probably my least favorite team to watch, mostly because I don't think they have much going on by comparison, but they certainly have their moments. Big is as funny as ever, and Cream the Rabbit, a kind, young, rabbit who debuted in Sonic Advance 2 on the GBA, is a decent addition to the cast. Also, Amy chases after Sonic even more now, so yeah, that's a thing. There's also this moment in Final Fortress.
Oh my god!
Yeah, speaks for itself. However, my favorites of the bunch have to be Team Dark and Team Chaotix. Team Dark's members have a really similar dynamic to the Dark Story characters from SA2. They can all be somewhat extreme and tend to clash in hilarious ways. I find this especially funny with E123 Omega. He's the ultimate E-Series robot created by Eggman. Interestingly, Gamma was originally going to come back instead, but I'm honestly glad they didn't do that. Personally, I don't see any possible way that his return wouldn't feel forced after the arc he went through in SA1, so the fact they went for a new E-Series robot was the right call in my book. Omega is this all-powerful death machine, but despite that, he essentially had his powers wasted to guard the Doctor's base. This has left him pissed off at his creator, and so he vows to destroy him. He's really dedicated to this goal, and makes sure the other members of the team are fully aware of that.
Cool city.
Our top priority is Eggman. Don't forget that. No time to wait.
You're too serious, Omega.
It never fails to make me laugh. Team Chaotix is quite similar in this respect, and their three members are often just as extreme as those of Team Dark. They're modeled after the team of the same name from the 32X title Knuckles' Chaotix, but have basically been totally reinvented as a struggling detective agency that will take up any case to pay the rent. By the way, speaking of that game, I personally don't consider it canon. For me, the reason is quite simple. Knuckles doesn't know who the Chaotix are, and Mighty the Armadillo is nowhere to be seen in this game. So as far as I'm concerned, this is where the Chaotix debuted in the Sonic timeline. It's possible that game takes place after this one, but as a certain future game confirms, the evolution of the art design would contradict that. Of course, that's not objective fact. Your mileage may vary when it comes to this whole canonicity thing. That's especially true in the case of Sonic, or any series that wasn't planned out from the start lore-wise that just decides it wants to have a more consistent world at some point or another. I don't tend to enjoy discussing this sort of thing for that very reason. Shit's a headache. I don't consider Knuckles' Chaotix canon to the series. Maybe you do.
I don't really care. Let's just move on.
Vector can be rather abrasive, in contrast to the calm and calculated SPO and the hyperactive and childish Charmy, and they too often make me laugh with how they interact and banter with each other.
Here we go.
Chips? You mean potato chips?
Not those kind of chips, silly.
Although, again, I will admit that Charmy can be a bit irritating sometimes. I wouldn't say he's so bad in Heroes specifically, but...
Hey, Shadow. I gotta ask Yellow Water. That picture wants me
Nothing's good. What I like the most is that they're minding their own business, basically just trying to get work to pay their bills, but end up getting inadvertently roped into this whole scheme. In addition to all that, Eggman is as glorious as ever. I wouldn't say his appearance here is necessarily the character at his peak like he was in SA2, but that's okay since I find that a pretty high bar to clear. I'd say Eggman is ideally portrayed as a serious bad guy that doesn't need to tell you he means business, but one who's also goofy enough to have a comedic edge, even if he doesn't pull elaborate 5,000 IQ genius schemes to one-up the heroes or what have you. If you ask me, Eggman still has plenty of entertaining moments in this game.
Don't get too excited, boys. Those were the easy ones.
I definitely can't say the same thing about the bosses with the Doctor, though, and really all of them for that matter. The designs for the Doctor's vehicles, all of which are based on some sort of bird, are pretty cool, but fighting them is another story. As a newcomer, their lengthy health bars may make them seem really drawn out, but if you know to search for power cores to increase your strength, it makes them about as easy as the previous game's fights. I also find the two enemy rush bosses, Robot Carnival and Robot Storm, really tedious no matter how I slice it, and the typical character battles are probably the worst they've been. In my experience, they switch between trivially easy and obnoxious at completely random intervals. The cutscenes before them are often hilariously over the top, like when Rouge sees Team Chaotix and starts yelling at them unprovoked.
You guys don't fool me. I know what you're after. Better stay out of my way.
But the actual fights leave a lot to be desired. Although, speaking of the teams, there's still 3 other playthroughs waiting there for you on the selection screen. Like I said, Team Sonic basically is this game to me, because I find it the most replayable. It offers everything I love about the game in a solid package that I think is really fun to come back to. However, much like the alternate playable characters in SA1, even though you technically aren't required to play the other teams, I still think it's worth it to at least cover them a little bit. It would be pretty half-assed of me not to do so, the way I see it anyway. Also, as you'll see, the other teams are kind of required in a sense. So, how are they? Well, at the very least, I can say I enjoy playing as them all, because at the end of the day, they all share the same gameplay style. All of them go through the same levels, so at least in isolation, they all basically have the same strengths as one another. If I had to pick my favorite of the non-Team Sonic ones, it would have to be Team Dark. Honestly, I find Team Rose a bit boring by comparison, since, as I've already established, it's the easy mode of the game, with stages that end before they really get going if you ask me. I also find their plotline to be the least interesting out of all 4. I mean, they're just minding their own business, and then they get a newspaper clipping indicating that Sonic might have taken Chocola and Froggy, and so they go after him to look for him. Then it turns out he doesn't have them, and it's actually Eggman, and yeah, you know, I just don't find it that interesting. Kind of like Big's story from Sonic Adventure 1, actually. Additionally, you have to play Seagate before getting into the game proper, a forced tutorial level where Omo Chow constantly stops you in your tracks to talk your ear off. Despite that, I'd still say newcomers should start with their playthrough for obvious reasons. It eases you into the game and gives you a chance to get used to its mechanics. Also, it's really funny to see Big the Cat running around destroying enemies effortlessly, and hey, wait a minute, Big is playable again? And he's not fishing? Now that's more like it. In this game, Big does stuff like using his fishing rod as a baseball bat to fling the other characters at enemies, and see, this is what I meant in my SA1 review. If you're gonna make Big playable, I would much prefer something like this. Something where he uses his fishing rod in creative ways for combat mechanics that complement the action platforming the series is known for, rather than in some weird shoehorned fishing minigame. Also, when you grind on rails as Big, yeah, ouch. Even with that said though, I think Team Dark is a whole lot more interesting to play. Sure, their stages can be quite long even from the start, and they feature gigantic hordes of enemies as well as really tricky platforming, but I don't really mind. I mean, for one, they are the game's dedicated hard mode, so it's kind of what I would expect anyways. I find the extra challenge quite exhilarating, with stages that really demand platforming prowess and being able to level your characters up as much as possible. Some may find it frustrating, and on my first playthrough I certainly did, but after playing this game more than once and getting better at it each time, I've come to enjoy it quite a bit. Now, I won't lie, it still has its flaws. Shielded enemies are rather common, especially in the later levels, which I find slows the pace down. Certain gameplay segments are just kind of slow in general in my opinion, namely Robot Storm and Final Fortress. I didn't really care for these to begin with, but as Team Dark I think they're especially tedious and get tiring rather quickly. Other than that though, any issues I take with this campaign, such as the occasional glitch, are pretty much just carried over from the other ones. Whenever I play Team Dark, I still have fun with it, and I find their iterations of the levels are some of the more satisfying of all the teams. Not only does it feel good to overcome the greater challenge, but I find the hidden hidden items and paths are the most frequent here. In addition, I'd say their story is probably the most interesting of the bunch. It opens up with Rouge infiltrating one of Eggman's bases, located deep underground. She's searching for none other than Shadow the Hedgehog, who, yes, survived his heroic sacrifice in SA2. At first glance, that may seem weird. In the previous game, it really appears like he died as he fell back through the atmosphere, and yet here he is, doing just fine. You probably already know what happened. Shiro Maikawa actually did originally intend Shadow to be a one-off character. He would appear in SA2, go through with the arc of remembering his true purpose, and then give his life to save humanity from destruction, never to reappear again. However, he would end up being a really popular character, prompting Sega to ask for him to return in Sonic Heroes, and the rest is history. I must admit, while this does undeniably take something away from the strong character progression I so heavily praised in SA2, including its emotional ending, I think they did about as much as they could to make his return as smooth as possible. For one, the Dark Hedgehog was once again held in suspended animation deep in some base, so it's clear he needed some sort of help or life support to get back to a healthy state. In addition, when he wakes up, he has a severe case of amnesia, and doesn't remember the events of the Ark incident, only having vague memories of the stuff that took place during it, and who was involved with it. Eggman had locked him deep in the base for whatever purpose, and upon awakening and recognizing him in a brief encounter, he makes it his mission to track the Doctor down and regain his memories. All the while, Omega tries to destroy the Egghead because he's pissed off at him, like I said, but that's beside the point. Throughout the game, Shadow confronts the Doctor and asks him why he was locked away on that base, as well as what happened to get him there, but he won't budge. Eggman insists that Shadow has nothing to remember, and before he can ask for more information, the Doctor flees. Now you may ask, why doesn't Rouge just tell Shadow who he is? I don't know, that's one of those things that probably could have been explained better. To be honest, the fact he remembers some things kinda does clue me into the fact that maybe she was telling him. I don't know, it's kind of confusing, but regardless, what's going on here? Well, when the team meets up with Eggman after braving Rail Canyon and Bullet Station, they realize that they were chasing after a fake all along, and right beside him they observe the remnants of a robotic version of Shadow. Yeah, that carries some heavy implications as to what's happening. All he can do is stare blankly at it, pondering what this may mean for him. Could it be that he, who Rouge saved, is actually nothing but a mere robotic clone? Maybe the Shadow that she had been looking for all along isn't the hero that saved the world from the Ark incident. That hunch only seems to be strengthened by the discovery she makes at the end of the campaign. On board Eggman's massive flagship is hundreds, maybe even thousands of clones of Shadow just sitting there ominously. Eggman really was building an army of Shadow androids, and as far as Rouge knows, the one they've been traveling with was a fake all along. Even if that's the case, however, Shadow still seems to be the same guy from the end of SA2. He doesn't wake up and automatically want to cause as much destruction as possible or whatever. In fact, the first thing he does is protect Rouge from Omega's attack. And all throughout the story, he seems to have some memory of those he met, including Sonic and even Rouge. That seems to suggest that this Shadow is indeed the original, and that he did survive the events of the Ark. Did Eggman rescue Shadow after he fell from space? Or did he really just create some clone? For now, we don't know, but in practice, it may as well not even matter, because the more you see Shadow, the more clear it becomes that he's the same guy on the inside, irrespective of whether or not he's real. As he says before Eggfleet,
You'll regret this, Doctor. Even if I'm not real, I'm still the ultimate life form, Shadow the Hedgehog.
honestly, for as simple and ultimately silly as this story may be, I find this element fairly interesting. It speaks to the strength of Shadow's character. Whether he's the true Shadow or just some android clone, he plans to fight the Doctor and protect those of the world from his evil. It's the same thing as that one moment from SA2 where Rouge suggests his memories may not be real, albeit now with the opposite alignment following a change of heart. Even if he's not the true Shadow, he's still going to do what he feels is right and stop the evil Doctor from conquering the world. If you ask me, it's good stuff. So yeah, that's the teams that make up the whole difficulty select they wanted to make, which only leaves Team Chaotix. You may remember a while ago, in this video that's quickly becoming way longer than I ever expected it to be, I mentioned how these guys are kind of the odd ones out in this game. Instead of acting as a difficulty of sorts, their playthrough is closer in spirit to that bizarre mission mode from SADX. Whereas the other teams all see you simply reaching the goal ring with no strings attached, Team Chaotix's levels often have you completing some sort of task, such as killing a bunch of enemies or collecting a certain number of some object. Some do simply ask you to reach the goal ring, but even then a few of those include stealth elements with Espia's cloak ability, activated by doing the usual tornado move. In my old video on this game, I said that Team Chaotix was the only team I disliked out of the four. I complained about the missions dragging down the pace of the game and felt they didn't mesh well with the action platforming the game goes for. In one sense, I still kind of feel this way. With how breakneck the pacing in this game is, having you search for collectibles may seem somewhat out of place. Some particular missions, namely the one in Mystic Mansion with all the torches you have to find, are rather tedious if you ask me. The thing is, the real problem is if you miss even one item somewhere in the stage, which isn't too hard to accidentally do. Unlike the hunting stages from the previous games, which were open sandboxes, Heroes' stages are entirely comprised of the series' traditional linear obstacle courses. This isn't ideal for collectible hunting, because it makes it way harder or even sometimes impossible to backtrack. So if you miss something, you'll have to teleport back to the start of the stage and cycle through the entire thing again to find it. Thankfully, once you collect something, it's yours forever, even if you die, so there's no need to worry about that, but I still find it can drag down the pace if you don't know what you're doing. That's the main thing, however, if you don't know what you're doing. Much like a lot of things in this series, the key to success is often found in knowing what to do. My original review was the first time I'd ever played Team Chaotix, so I'm not surprised I held a negative opinion on their campaign by its end. However, this time around, I knew where to go, so I didn't have nearly as miserable of an experience with it. Some missions were way more straightforward and even more enjoyable than I remember them being. Because of that, I was able to get more out of them. Now, that's not to say I'm willing to just brush their flaws under the rug. I haven't forgotten what that first time experience was like, and because of that, I'll always have some level of aversion to their playthrough. On top of that, I'm also just not a fan of when games feel the need to shove force collecting into linear obstacle course level design. I find it to be an unwelcome distraction when I'm just trying to enjoy said levels for what they are, but then get stopped by some progression gate that forces you to explore levels that I feel weren't really designed for it. Now, that may sound strange for me to say, because I did praise this game's levels design for its exploratory elements, but my big thing with that is player discretion. I don't mind exploring linear levels when it's all up to me if I want to. Usually it's just to cut time off my run of a stage or to find hidden items as a reward for looking around. That being said, as soon as you want to force that, that's where I tend to take issue with it. I don't mean to say it's completely impossible to make it fun, but oftentimes I find games do it in a way that makes the collecting a chore. And again, this is just the case with linear stages. In something like the treasure hunting from the previous games, I didn't mind it because those levels were built from the ground up for collectible hunting. In my opinion, mandatory collection works best in sandbox-like levels. Here in Sonic Heroes, no such luck. Again, I can't say I hated my time playing this campaign for this video. It went mostly smooth, but at best I can't really call their playthrough any better than inoffensive as it is. It's an interesting idea, but in my opinion the execution leaves a lot to be desired. But hey, like I said earlier, I find their story pretty entertaining. Being a struggling detective agency that will do anything to pay off their mountains of rent, Team Chaotix takes up work from a mysterious client who is very mysterious and totally not Eggman isn't. All the while, they just have to put up with the other team's shit. Like when Rouge starts accosting them in that scene I mentioned when talking about Team Dark. From their perspective, it makes a bit more sense, but from the Chaotix's, it's literally just this random lady that starts screaming at them and then they fight. Then you get to the boss after Lost Jungle, and they come across Team Rose. Vector tries to ask Amy something, but
If it's about a date, it'll have to wait.
Jade! You think this is a joke, you little bro?
geez, Amy, are you really that concerned about getting in a relationship with Sonic? After this, the three make an actually reasonable assumption that they kidnapped Chocolate Chow, since they were seen collecting a bunch of Chow, but the way this cutscene is framed is just so funny to me. Oh yeah, and then you have the end of the game, where they fight through Eggman's airship fleet, only to come across the Doctor holed up in a room all alone. Well, so he was their client all along. How shocking and unexpected. The three ask him where their promised money is, and he makes it clear he was scamming them for money he doesn't have. Upon learning this, the team does the only appropriate thing.
Some nerve promising what you ain't got. We've been had. Just wait a minute. Just listen to me.
Take this, you bad man!
I don't really know what else to say about this. I think Team Chaotix's story is the funniest one in the game, and it's because of how easy they are to relate to. While yes, it's a story about cartoony animals doing ridiculous things, the theme of being stuck in a crappy job you have to do anyway to pay the bills is as funny as it is kind of sad now that I think about it. Oh yeah, and the team's theme song is quite catchy too. Which reminds me, after all this time talking about Sonic on my channel lately, I'm pretty sure my feelings towards its music are rather clear. All the games, even some of the ones I was more critical and negative towards, had at least one constant, and that's some banger music. The Genesis games established the standard, and if you ask me, the adventure games brought the music to new heights with their CD quality instrumentation and emphasis on rock music. Sonic Heroes features more of what I loved so much about this previous game's music, and I'd say they managed to hit the ball out of the park once again. In fact, the more I think about this game's soundtrack, the more I may even consider it my favorite of the games I've covered so far. Though with how great these soundtracks have been, I'm not really sure about that one. Point is, I love Sonic music, and Heroes' soundtrack is no exception. It's such a sensational collection of tracks, if I had to describe it in one word. Each and every song evokes an atmosphere that really complements the various locations you're traveling through. And in general, I think they're just really good songs. If I had to pick favorites, why would you make me do that? I think pretty much all of them are awesome songs that make the game all the more enjoyable. I also love the vocal themes, once again performed by the same vocalists from the previous games as well as some new ones. My favorites are easily Team Dark's theme, This Machine, performed by Julian K. And the aptly named Team Chaotix by Gunnar Nelson. And while the game's main theme, simply titled Sonic Heroes, is one that says the game's name repeatedly, I don't really mind because, well, it's a really good song, and that's all there is to that. Crush 40 made another banger main theme, and you can never go wrong with the Johnny Joeli vocals and Jun Sonoy guitars. I've pretty much spoken my piece on this game's soundtrack. I think it's fantastic and one of Sonic's best collection of songs. Which may not be saying much because that's a pretty exhaustive list. Also, not to mention, in Hang Castle and Mystic Mansion, the song dynamically changes depending on the orientation of the level or what part of it you're in. Kinda like Banjo-Kazooie. This is the first Sonic game to do something like that, as far as I know, so that's pretty cool. Another thing I really love about Sonic Heroes is how it looks. In fact, I'd say it's probably the best looking 3D Sonic game yet. For one, the Gamecube and Xbox versions make use of the console's progressive scan mode to produce an image that ages way better on a technical level. And all versions except PS2 hit a pretty rock solid 60 FPS. But that's only the beginning. Sonic Heroes also carries over the same mixture of cartoony environments and semi-realistic textures the adventure games went for, but with even more detailed models, geometry, and whatnot. What I especially love is the creative art direction and level themes. Admittedly, I am a bit bummed out that this game's levels aren't as interconnected together to create a sense of world building like the previous 3D games, and even Sonic 3 and Knuckles did to an extent. But the aesthetics themselves make up for that in my opinion. I love how colorful they all are, and I find their sheer scale impressive for a 2003 release. I'd say it's about on par with Ratchet & Clank 2 or Battle for Bikini Bottom in this regard, two games that came out the same year, which I also praise for impressive environments. Considering the fact that Sonic Team was using a whole new engine they were unfamiliar with, I think they knocked it out of the park. As for the actual level aesthetics themselves, I find they're a pleasing mix of old and new. In keeping with that theme of invoking some elements from the Genesis titles, some levels are based on tropes from them. For example, Seaside Hill has grassy fields and checkerboard rock walls, much like Green Hill Zone. Grand Metropolis and Power Plant take place in a futuristic city, just like, well, Metropolis, so. And Frog Forest features large mushrooms and vines, much like Mushroom Hill Zone. There are a few things from the adventure duo too, such as Rail Canyon, which really reminds me of Skyrail, and the two final stages, which heavily smack of the Egg Carrier. But for the most part, the callbacks try to invoke Sonic 1, 2, and 3 Knuckles. That being said, while these stages are clearly inspired by the older games, I think they look new enough to not feel too samey. In the case of Seaside Hill, Green Hill's elements are combined with a beach aesthetic. Grand Metropolis and Power Plant feature flying cars and greenhouses located high up on buildings, and Frog Forest, as its name suggests, also has huge frogs. In addition to that, many levels are unique looking as far as Sonic games go, such as the spookiness of Hang Castle and Mystic Mansion, or these gigantic guns in Bullet Station. Also, Egg Fleet just looks awesome, and is probably my favorite level in the game aesthetically. I don't really know what else to say, I love how this game's environments look. In addition to all that, the models are probably the best they've been, in my opinion. They're all based on Yuji Uekawa's art yet again, which was basically the default for Sonic during this time period. I'm glad about that, because in my opinion, no one managed to capture the personality of this series in art form quite as well as he did. The models reflect this, and they're probably the highest poly ones so far. I will admit the models don't look quite as nice when viewed up close. Their textures seem kind of plasticky to me and their colors are a bit flat, but during gameplay I find them rather appealing. Interestingly enough, Rouge also has a slightly different design than she did in SA2. The latter would eventually become her default appearance, which makes the way she looks in this game rather distinct, so that's neat. I can say the same thing about the enemies and bosses too. I already mentioned the egg pawns, which bring out a surprising amount of variety in designs from a relatively simple base. However, I'd say the real highlight is all of Eggman's contraptions. As I said before, they're all based on birds. Egg Hawk, Egg Albatross, Egg Emperor, I think you see it. I think it's a pretty cool motif that's rather fitting because, well, you know, it's Dr. Eggman, and which animal is well known for laying eggs again? That's right! Dogs. No, it's birds. It's birds. I especially love how the Egg Albatross looks, being this huge blimp-like contraption with all sorts of cannons controlled by egg pawns. When you destroy the first phase, only the blimp is left over, and after that, the Egg Hog yet again. Honestly, I don't really know what to tell you, I just find that so cool. I can't say the same thing about this game's promotional renders, though. Yeah, I mentioned them a bit before, but I don't think they look that appealing. As I've gone on record saying before, CG only holds up as well as the technology does, and well, clearly the technology used to make these renders doesn't really hold up anymore. Nevertheless, though, Sonic Heroes is a very visually and musically pleasing game if you ask me, and I can't get enough of its gorgeous visuals and catchy soundtrack. In addition, because I really have nowhere better to mention this, Sonic Heroes continues the tradition of 3D Sonic games, including extra content to mess around with, although it doesn't have quite as much stuff as either of the adventure games. For one, there's no Chow Garden in this game, which I'm sure is very disappointing for some. For me, though, I don't really mind. I never cared much for the Chow Garden, because when I come to a Sonic game, I come for for the fast-paced action gameplay, not a virtual pet simulator. I'd go see my real-life pets if I wanted that. But hey, that's just me. I can see why people love the Chow Garden, so if you're disappointed Heroes axed it, I get that. So what does this game have? Well, after you beat a team, you unlock not only a Sonic 3 and Knuckles style zone select on the team menu, but also what the game refers to as challenge mode. At least that's what the option says. In reality, it's pretty much the same thing as the stage select from SA2, except without the cool looking world map, but that's beside the point. For each team you've cleared, you can pick any stage from this game in isolation and play it. So yes, me saying that the zone select was the only way to replay the second act of each zone in the original video was actually false. Boy, do I love spreading misinformation. This feature will come in handy for something later, but the main thing this mode offers is the optional missions, returning from the previous games. In those games, there were multiple missions in each stage, but here I think they did the right thing in making only one per level. Rather than each one having up to 4 kind of repetitive extra missions to clear, which by the way only unlock sequentially, meaning you have to play them in order, the objectives have been divided among the 4 teams. Team Sonic has the returning time trials, and you'll have to beat each stage in 5 minutes. Team Dark has to destroy a bunch of enemies. Team Rose plays expanded versions of the ring missions that ask you to collect double the amount SA2 did. And Team Chaotix has their existing objectives expanded or slightly altered in some way. To be honest though, while I like how these missions are handled here more than the previous games, I still don't have much of an incentive to complete all of them. With the exception of Team Chaotix, you're doing the same exact thing every single stage. That's not too bad in the case of Team Sonic, and I find the time trials decent fun. Given how long this game's levels can be, you really gotta haul ass to beat the missions in time. Usually this involves using Sonic to speed through sections you'd otherwise want to take your time with, which can be an interesting challenge. For Team Dark and Team Rose though, yeah, I don't like these missions. I find Rose's ring mission really boring and easy to accomplish, but Dark's enemy challenges can eat it. I tried the one in Seaside Hill, and while it was fun exploring the level for as many enemies as I could find, at first, by the end, I was missing one, yes, just one enemy. There were a bunch on these bobsled sections, which, by the way, I don't really care for that much anyway, which I find really dumb. The bobsled can barely turn and travels really fast, so it's really easy to miss enemies on the way. Also, if you reach the end of the stage while missing any of them, you aren't allowed to warp back to the start to search for more. At least as far as I could tell. Yeah, I noped out of that one. I also feel the same about Chaotix's missions. If you thought their normal missions were bad, just you wait till they're optional ones. Collect all 20 hermit crabs, collect all 20 casino chips, you get the idea. Their standard missions only ask you to collect a certain amount of a thing in most cases, but here in the optional missions, your ass has to collect every last one of them. The absolute nadir of this is definitely the Blue Torch mission in Mystic Mansion. I already didn't really like the Red Torch mission, I thought it was really tedious and boring, but the Blue Torch mission was even worse. These things are hidden in really bullshit spots, like this one over a pit, or ones you just have to know about in the final room. By the end of this one, I was also short by only one torch. Guess where it was? Hidden behind this platform with a crusher on it. Yeah, because everyone was going to find that when you can't even see it with the default camera angle. Playing this mission reminded me of what my first time with the Red Torch mission was like. In other words, a complete chore. And if you ask me, it's probably the single worst bit of gameplay in this entire game. Yeah, in case you can't tell, I don't really care much for these optional missions. As with the adventure games, I'm sure someone out there will get something out of them. I just don't. Maybe with the exception of Team Sonic's time trials. So, what about the multiplayer? Well, I have played it a bit before, and honestly, it's a downgrade from SA2 Battle. It runs at 30 FPS, and I don't find the modes nearly as fun as the previous games. Maybe I'm just biased, who the hell knows, and it has been a while since I played Heroes' version of the mode, but I don't really play the multiplayer in these games anyway because I'm lonely, so... yeah. In addition to all that stuff, Sonic Heroes also brings back what I consider the most brilliant feature introduced in SA2, the ranking system. I'm really glad this feature became a series staple, because in case you don't remember from last time, I thought it added so much to it. Sonic has always been a series that placed a heavy emphasis on crafting replay value through skill mastery, which was always merely intrinsic. Starting with SA2 though, the ranking system also served as an extrinsic reward that enhanced the intrinsic value the game provided, giving you feedback on how well you're playing and creating a tangible representation of your progress. Well, unless you're like me and record pretty much everything you play, thus capturing any cool skips you may pull off on footage, but that's neither here nor there. Sonic Heroes brings it back, and I'd say it once again succeeds in providing that extra incentive to get better at the game. But I wouldn't say it's perfect. I have reached the point where I've started earning A ranks on some levels and missions, but I honestly don't enjoy doing it quite as much as I did in SA2. I mean, the much longer stages make it a whole lot more tedious to restart if you screw up, but I think the real issue is those moments of lacking polish I brought up before. As with SA2, dying resets your score to 0, and in a game where it's possible to occasionally die in a way that doesn't feel like your fault, Yeah, I think I've said enough. You may play extremely well at this stage, and then get tripped up by a fatal scripting error near the end, thus forcing you to replay the entire 6 to 8, or even 10 to 12 minute stage again from the start to get the highest rank. That's pretty much it for me, honestly. I'm still glad the ranks are here, and I enjoy getting the highest one when I can, but I wouldn't actively try to get them like I do in SA2 because of that. Whereas A-ranking the stages is more fun for me in that game than standard play. Here in Heroes, I'd rather just play it normally while paying no mind to it. I mean, all you unlock for getting them all is the super hard mode anyway, which is just kind of a 5th playthrough of the same levels. I mean, it's a little lame in comparison to Green Hill Zone, if you ask me. Although, the final reward just being another way to play the same game again, that does remind me. So there you have it. That's pretty much everything the game has to offer. Mostly. There is still one thing I've intentionally neglected up until now, and it's probably my overall biggest criticism of Sonic Heroes as a package. Remember how I said this game was designed to be a pick up and play sort of game? In some ways that is true. You can pick up your favorite team and play as them without touching any of the others. However, like the previous games, there's also a last story segment, and unlocking it of course requires beating all 4 teams. This is where a weird issue manifests itself. In essence, it's similar to what I criticized SA1 for. Throughout that game's various character campaigns, you'd often have to replay the same levels and bosses, walk around the same hub worlds in the same way, and watch the same cutscenes repeatedly to reach the Supersonic campaign that closed out the story. The crux of the issue was repetition, which in my opinion made revisiting that game more of a chore than I thought it ought to be. In Sonic Heroes, the issue is essentially the same, except I'd argue even worse. Whereas SA1's campaigns had different gameplay styles and didn't make you go through every single stage, Sonic Heroes is the complete opposite. All 4 teams play essentially the same, minus some slight mechanical differences between pairs of them. It's really minor stuff, like Sonic and Shadow being able to lightspeed dash while Amy and Espio can't. Each one also has to play the same 14 stages, making for an unprecedented total of 56 levels, and you'll also face off against every boss 4 times. And remember, these things have a tendency to go on for a while, even when you're experienced with the game. I like playing as most of these teams in isolation, but when reaching the last story, this game gets really repetitive for me to play by the end, to the point I sometimes end up waiting an entire week between team playthroughs, just so I don't start going crazy. I get that finishing all the elements of the game to unlock the last part of the story makes sense, but in this case, I think it leads to a lot of unnecessary repetition. But that isn't it. Yeah, beating all 4 teams still isn't sufficient to unlock the last story segment. So you remember the special stages, right? They were these optional bonus levels of sorts from the 2D games that gave you Chaos Emeralds. Or if not that, at least extra lives and continues. Keyword of course being optional. I didn't really care for any of them besides Blue Sphere from Sonic 3 and Knuckles, which is why I'm glad they were never required to finish the games. In Sonic Heroes though, the emeralds aren't a major plot point like they were in the adventure games, so they've once again been relegated to collectibles earned from special stages. Except this time, you have to go for all 7 to unlock the last story segment. I have several issues with this, but I'd say the most significant one isn't actually the stages themselves, but rather getting to them. This game features something similar to Sonic 1 and CD's method, where you have to reach the end of a stage while in possession of something. However, instead of 50 rings, you'll have to find a key somewhere in the stage. There's only about 3 or 4 in each level, and they're often hidden in really out-of-the-way locations. If you do manage to track one down, don't take any damage, because getting hit will make you lose the key and force you to find another one. If there's no more, you've just lost your chance at getting at the special stage. In my opinion, it turns this fast-paced and fun game into a slow, methodical one that's unnecessarily stressful. One mistake, and you may have to replay the entire stage from the start to try again. That's exactly why I recommend doing these special stages as Team Rose, because there's so much less you'll have to replay if you mess up. If you actually do manage to reach a special stage, well, for one, you'd better make sure you do it on the second act of a zone. The first act only has a bonus challenge that gives you extra lives for completing it, and no emeralds. I just find it to be a kind of a dumb choice, honestly. I mean, did Sonic 1, 2, CD, and 3 and Knuckles arbitrarily restrict you to only getting emeralds in a certain act of each zone? I think I made my point. Anyways, let's assume you've made it to an emerald challenge. How do the stages play? Well, they're pretty similar to the infamous half-pipe from Sonic 2. You know, that thing that wasn't good. The Chaos Emerald moves along the stage, and you have to catch up with it to collect it. Fail to do so, and you're kicked out with no option to try again. To maintain a fast enough speed to catch the emerald, there's these special orbs called links you have to collect, which fill up your... let me see here. Boost gauge. Wait, really? This early on? Nah, that's something. Anywho, the key to getting an emerald is to maintain an uninterrupted boost as long as possible. A simple objective on the surface, but if you ask me, these stages are rather unpolished. If you thought the controls were slippery in the main gameplay, then they're doubly so in these special stages. Even the slightest touch of a direction will send you flying to the side, potentially into these really annoying, pace-breaking ball spikes. Getting hit by one of these things awkwardly stops you in your tracks, so they must be avoided at all costs. But doing so is made a lot more irritating when you have controls like these, and the paths through the obstacles are often fairly narrow. I do have a great strategy though, and if done correctly it turns these stages into an absolute joke. On this playthrough I actually managed to get every Chaos Emerald on my first try, without needing to play any stage more than once per team. The trick is to switch to the power formation. Like in normal play, the 3 formations are usable here, and the bonus challenges even have those annoying formation swap gates that change which character you're controlling automatically. Thankfully the Emerald challenges don't though, because that would be really fucking annoying. Point is, you can switch from the speed character to the power formation, which gives a solid balance of speed and handling, counteracting a lot of the slipperiness while still allowing you to keep the pace up. Once you do that, you'll need to build up a bit of boost energy, and hold down the action button instead of mashing it. As you do this, steer and collect more links, and you should catch up with the emerald in a matter of seconds. I can't say this will work every time since the ball spikes can still get in the way, but for the most part, this strategy helped me get through each stage rather easily. Sure, that is rather lame, but honestly, I'll take it over the alternative of no such trick existing, and having whether or not you can reach the last story hinge on these stages' broken mechanics. Additionally, this system also has some aspects that make unlocking the epilogue relatively painless. For one, after completing a team's playthrough, you're free to enter challenge mode and replay the second stage of each act to go for the emerald again. I really wish screwing it up didn't force you to play the entire stage from the start and collect the key to try again, but that's what Team Rose is for. You also only have to get 7 emeralds on your save file, and neither have to collect them all as one team, nor as all 4 teams. As long as you collect all the emeralds as whatever combination of teams you'd like, the last story is yours. For this playthrough, I actually got 3 emeralds as Team Sonic, 2 as Team Dark, and the last 2 as Team Rose. That counts for unlocking the last story, as does any other combination. So yeah, while I really wish you weren't required to get the emeralds, I feel it could have been way worse. So anyway, how is that last story segment? Is it worth going through the trouble to unlock it? To be honest, not really. The segment starts where Team Chaotix's playthrough left off. Vector asks Eggman who locked him up, and
All living things kneel before your master.
oh my god, it's Metal Sonic. Eggman's own creation locked him up and is behind all the weird shenanigans that have been happening all this time. So, you remember how there were random fake Eggmans? Listen, I know it's technically Eggmen, but I find the word Eggmans really funny. I'm not sorry. Those fakes were intentional, all a part of Metal Sonic's plan. They were actually him under disguise, which he used to trick the teams into chasing after him. It was all to copy their data as a means of growing his power level back to where it was before. Or even greater than that, actually. This is why he kidnapped Froggy and Chocolate, why he lured Sonic and Shadow to talk to him, and why the real Eggman was locked away in a random room on his flagship. And now he's prepared to conquer the world all on his own. Right after he fulfills his purpose of defeating Sonic, of course. The teams all witness Metal transform into a massive beast, Metal Madness. Lost on what to do, Eggman wishes that they had the Chaos Emeralds, which... Okay, now as allies against a common enemy, 3 of the 4 teams faced off against Metal Madness in what I consider to be one of the better bosses in the game. In this fight, Metal has a few weak points on his abdomen. It will light up one of 3 colors, which represents the formation that he's currently immune to. For example, yellow means the flight formation can't hurt him, so you'll instead have to use power or speed. I think it's a pretty cool idea for a boss fight. Metal's attacks can be somewhat tricky to avoid, and you'll have to upgrade your characters to deal damage in the later phases, which when combined with the color coding makes it so you can't just mindlessly attack him with Thunder Shoot or Fireballs to win. I wouldn't say it's all that difficult, but for me it stands out in a game that otherwise has pretty mindless boss fights for the most part. Hell, even Egg Emperor, the final boss of each team campaign, is really easy if you can reach max level with the flight formation. Metal Madness probably gets my pick for the game's best boss, even if I don't find it hard. Above all else, it's a neat idea, and sometimes that's all you really need. Although I don't like how you have to make this one janky cannon shot to return to the platform during the Team Chaotix phase. Unless you meet some nebulous criteria, you're probably gonna go flying to your death. Not that bad since each phase has a checkpoint, but still, I'm not really a fan of that. Once you defeat Metal though, he's not quite done. He transforms again into his final form, this gigantic thing. This is Metal Overlord. Without any words though, Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles know what they have to do. They grab the Chaos Emeralds, prepare to go Super, and when they power up, oh well, Sonic turns into Super Sonic, but Tails and Knuckles just get shields. Yeah, that's kind of lame. Honestly, I feel the same about the actual fight against Metal Overlord. For one, this is the final boss, and therefore the last segment of gameplay. Yeah, like SA1, there's no big final stage to cap things off. I'm glad they kept the element of all the characters teaming up for a common goal, including with Eggman putting aside his differences to help the heroes defeat greater evil again. But the lack of a Cannon's Core-esque stage is a bit of a bummer in my opinion, because it would have made the segment all the more impactful. I also don't really care for the boss itself in terms of gameplay. It's probably my least favorite Supersonic boss thus far, actually. You fly around as Team supersonic, yes, I did just call them that, shut up, and collect rings to avoid dying as usual. As Metal attacks you, you'll have to, I don't know, parry those attacks? Counter them with your own, whatever you want to call it. Doing so builds up the Team Blast gauge, which is the only way to actually deal damage to him. 6 or so Team Blasts and he's a goner. My issue with this fight is that it just feels clunky and awkward to me. The team's super forms don't control especially well, and sometimes you'll get stunned by one of Metal's attacks, even if by all rights it feels like it should have counted as more energy for your gauge. I also find the one move where Metal can freeze you with Chaos Control really annoying, since you have to mash the button for 10 tedious seconds to get out of it. Although I'm glad you don't have to wait like the full 15 seconds, you can actually speed it up, so that's cool, but still. As a result of these things, I don't care much for this fight. When I get down to it, I don't think it's mechanically satisfying. However, I can't say I hate it, and that's because of everything else. I love the aesthetic with the stormy skies that surround you throughout the whole thing. And the song that plays, What I'm Made Of, is another Crush 40 banger. Metal Overlord's design is also downright cool. Metal Sonic already had a solid, distinct appearance, and seeing him transform into this monster is, well, cool. That's all I can really say. Especially with his booming voice, which, fun fact, is just Ryan Drummond with audio filters. I'm serious. Listen to the unfiltered voice, and it's quite literally Ryan doing an evil Sonic.
All lifeform data successfully copied.
All lifeform data successfully copied.
I love that. It's just so funny to me, yet when I think about it, it's like, of course. What else would his voice be, considering Metal Sonic was designed to be an evil replacement for the Hedgehog? Which, by the way, reminds me, during this fight, we also get the ultimate reason behind why Metal Sonic did this. It's all because of what he was created for from the start.
Sonic, I was created for the sole purpose of destroying you. But I can never seem to defeat you. That is why I transform my own body with my own hands.
You actually thought you could defeat me by transforming into a monster?
But that was the past. Now you're nothing but a speck of dust to me. See me as I am, no longer afraid of anything.
Metal Sonic was originally designed by Eggman to be a stronger version of Sonic, but in the end, he was never able to outmatch him, even after so many times facing off against him. This left Metal with feelings of fear and inadequacy, and he wanted to rise up again someday to take Sonic out like he was designed to. As we can see in SA1, Eggman still kept him around, but he was pretty much out of commission. Presumably he managed to escape sometime since then, and through an elaborate scheme of trickery, managed to build up his power in an attempt to fulfill his goal, now transforming himself into the monster you see in this fight. I think it's a pretty interesting exploration of his character, something that wasn't ever really done before. In my opinion, it's really welcome added depth. Before, I thought Metal Sonic was a pretty one-dimensional character with a cool design, and it's this game where I feel he peaked as a character. It shows that while a stoic copy of Sonic that tried everything he could to fulfill his directive of destroying him, he still harbored some insecurities behind the facade. That is, until his fear ultimately led him to do what he did, becoming a monster in an attempt to take out Sonic and rule the world as the ultimate being. In the end, though, he's no match for the heroes, and they managed to neutralize him.
Too bad it's all over. For you!
You just got roasted! Yeah!
Now that's perfect. Anyway, back on the final fortress, things have settled down. Metal is back in his weak, standard form, and before long, Sonic and Tails run off as Amy chases the former. Big and Cream say goodbye to her, as Knuckles laughs about it. Rouge then comes by and says she feels like looking for someone else's treasure, which Knuckles decides to join in on for old time's sake. As he does that, the Chaotix celebrate another case wrapped up, but then Charmy points out that they still haven't gotten their money yet. Cut to Eggman trying to sneak out, thinking they wouldn't remember, as they chase after him. Always makes me laugh. Meanwhile, Shadow and Omega pick up Metal Sonic, their intentions unclear. So yeah, as you may have noticed, Shadow's amnesia isn't quite resolved in this game, actually leaving this game out on an open plot thread. That's something new for Sonic, which I find pretty interesting. Now, whether or not it was properly followed up on, that remains to be seen, but at the time, it could potentially lead into anything, which I just find pretty cool to think about. The game then ends off on a shot of Team Sonic reunited, as they strike the pose featured on the game's box art. If you ask me, this ending wraps the game up on a nice note. That being said though, I wouldn't really say it's all that worth it to complete all 4 teams and collect all 7 Chaos Emeralds to unlock this. It is cool to see Metal Sonic fully power up into the beast he becomes, and to hear about his motivation for doing so. But honestly, outside of a decent enough boss and some funny moments in the cutscenes, I don't think this segment is really necessary to say you experience everything the game has to offer. While again, I do enjoy playing the game and most of its teams in isolation, despite the flaws I discussed, when you have to beat all 4 of them, playing all 14 stages, a total of 4 times each, and fighting the same bosses over and over with relatively little to differentiate the playthroughs, I don't know, I think it just gets a little tiresome after a while, irrespective of how fun the game itself is mechanically for me. It is definitely possible to have too much of a good thing, and I think playing all 4 teams in this game kinda falls into that trap. I also criticized SA1 for its filler content and padding, whether intentional or not, but I honestly think Sonic Heroes has it a little bit worse in that regard. Even with all that said, I would maybe be alright with saying the last story would be somewhat worth it to see how the game ends, but then there's the Chaos Emerald quest, which I've already thoroughly explained my beef with. In my opinion, this stuff just makes the game go on a bit too long. So whenever I come back to it, I usually stick to my favorite part of the game, Team Sonic. It gives me everything I love about this game with a satisfactory amount of challenge, levels that are neither too long nor too short for the most part, and relatively little fluff. That's something I respect the hell out of. Weirdly enough, it's a similar relationship to the one I have with SA1. I mostly play just one part of the game, but that part is one I unequivocally love. And hey, if I feel like it, there's a few others right there that aren't too shabby either, for the most part. However, I wouldn't always say that. I can say with confidence that the title of this video isn't a lie. I genuinely love playing Sonic Heroes and find that it's a fun game that just has some unfortunate issues here and there. It may not stack up to SA2 or 3 and Knuckles or whatever, it's not some timeless masterpiece, but it is a game that I really enjoy. But that's not how it was in my first playthrough. Remember how I was saving the discussion of my first time experience with Sonic Heroes until the end of the video? Well, buckle up, it's story time. I told this at the same spot in my original review, but now I can do it in a way that doesn't make me cringe profusely. But anyways, it was 2019 going into 2020. I was halfway through my senior year of high school, and I had no idea what we would all be in for the coming year. All I knew at that moment was that school was out, and I had just received a copy of this game for Christmas. This one right here that I showed earlier. Again, player's choice. Absolutely disgusting. Nevertheless, by that point, I was well into a Sonic binge. The year before that, I had gotten into the Genesis trilogy, which I really liked, especially Sonic 3 and Knuckles, but I'd fallen out of the series for a little bit because I got interested in other stuff like Spyro. In late summer 2019, I played Sonic CD, which reignited my interest in this fast blue hedgehog, and I made the jump to playing his 3D games, starting with the adventure titles. If you've seen those videos, this is the part I got the Dreamcast, and went on to play and finish both of them in early to late fall, and I was in love with them. Their fast-paced gameplay, the entertaining cutscenes and stories that felt like cheesy yet charming cult classic action movies, their incredible scope and desire to leave a grand impression, the multiple characters I loved playing as, the energy, the heart, the gameplay depth, all of it. I definitely preferred SA2 over the first one, which I still do to this day, as if you couldn't tell by the rather lopsided video lengths, but that's beside the point. The point being, these games only made me love the series even more. I would then go on to pick up their PC ports through Steam and also the Gamecube versions, because I just love the games that much. Naturally, this only made me want more. I knew the game started to get iffy in reception around 2005, so there was one particular game I had my sights set on. That was, of course, Sonic Heroes. I heard good things about it, including from those who loved the adventure games as much as I did. Since it was right around Christmas, I figured I might as well tell my family that that was what I wanted, and so my brother got me just that. I was thankful, of course, but before playing it, I went through the adventure games again, this time on Gamecube, and was once again reminded of my love for the series. With the games fresh on my mind, I then popped that Heroes disc into my Gamecube and ready for yet another fun experience. But this one was different. My initial impressions were solid enough, but as I played more and more, my opinion only began to sour. I was running into glitch after glitch, rough edge after rough edge, it felt like. I took major issue with how long the stages went on for, and bemoaned having to restart them every time after dying for reasons that felt like they were out of my hands. I hated how the characters controlled, I despised every boss fight, the in-stage dialogue got very grating, the special stages sucked, the story was boring, yada yada yada, all sorts of stuff like that. I honestly didn't want to believe it. After finishing Team Sonic and suffering through Egg Emperor, I still wanted to think, well, it's not that bad, right? You could say I was huffing the copium full force. I would then end up finishing Team Rose, but still nothing really changed. Then I attempted Team Dark, and this is where the breakdown finally happened, so to speak. I only vaguely remember what I went through playing as them for the first time around, but let me tell you, it wasn't pleasant. I do very clearly recall being stuck on their robot storm for over an hour, and then getting to Final Fortress, encountering some major glitch that prevented me from flying with Rouge, and then getting so mad that I took the game out of the console, put it back into its case, and then chucked it under my bed. I couldn't hold it in any longer, and officially accepted that what I had, I considered it a bad game. This was the first Sonic game I was ever disappointed by. I would try again every now and then, thinking that maybe there was just something I was missing. But by the time I reached Team Dark's Egg Emperor, I had enough and never touched again for the better part of half a year. Now, listen, I don't want to sound dramatic. It's a damn video game after all. It really doesn't matter much in the grand scheme of things. But in that moment, it mattered to me. Sonic was a spot of joy for me back then, and really it still is, but especially back then, it was a series that gave me something to enjoy through the stress of senior year. I had just wanted a game in the series I hadn't played before to give me some fun in my final year before graduating, much like the other games had, but no such luck. Really though, this story isn't unique by any means, and I've heard similar experiences from others before. Someone was excited for something, usually from a series or whatever that they follow, and saw it as a temporary escape from a crappy situation, but upon actually engaging with said thing, it left them so disgusted that they ultimately just became a little more miserable in the end. And on my first time playing this game, I had gone through the same thing. This idea I had that Heroes was garbage carried on for a while. However, I eventually decided to give the game another chance. I was now entering my freshman year of college. That's crazy to think about. God, where's the time going? Anyway, around that time, I actually sampled some of the games that came out after Heroes, and, I didn't think too highly of them, to put it nicely. On top of that, I watched a really long video making fun of a playthrough of the game. Not something I would do now, but back then it convinced me that maybe I was a little too harsh on this game. So with my Gamecube in my dorm, I fired it up for another playthrough one late October night, and played through the entirety of Team Sonic. This time, I finally started to warm up to the game. I started learning the ins and outs of it on the fly, including the importance of formation switching, the level up system, all of that. Did I still have some frustrating moments? Yes, absolutely. Did I set my initial expectations too high? Perhaps. But with the newfound appreciation for the game I was experiencing in that moment, the frustrating bits were more so isolated incidents rather than a constant running theme that got in my way, and any initial expectations didn't really matter to me anymore. All I knew was that I was having genuine fun with the experience, and had finally unlocked that hidden gem I had always hoped the game would be. I was now happy knowing that I had another solid Sonic game in my collection. And really, that's where I am today with this game. I played it a few times since then, including once all the way to the final story, and my appreciation for the game has only grown. I think it's a really fun game, and I enjoy it quite a lot. I find the story and dialogue goofy but still charming. The visuals, art design, and music absolutely rule. I think the three-person team gameplay is a unique creative idea that produces fun gameplay scenarios in its own right. The level design is some of my favorite in the series, and so on. I'm not a fan of how you unlock the last story segment, and the game certainly isn't the most polished thing in the world. In fact, I'd say it's a little more rough around the edges than even SA1 in some ways. However, I don't really mind, because the things this game does well are things I really think it does, and it's a game that always gives me a good time whenever I return to it, whether for another round of Team Sonic or for the whole thing. As I've been saying, I don't come back to it nearly as much as the adventure games or even the Genesis ones, with the exception of Sonic CD, many of the games from the other 1990s platformers video, and maybe Sonic 1 depending on how I'm feeling that Thursday. It's probably the weakest game I've covered so far, but that doesn't mean I dislike it.
That's why I think it's such a shame that Sega can't bring this game to Steam. The digital PC re-releases of the adventure games worked wonders for their accessibility, but sadly Heroes is still stuck as abandonware. Since it uses renderware, which is a proprietary engine, they'd have to license it to port the game. I imagine they don't want to do that at the moment, which really sucks because, again,
as the title says, I love Sonic Heroes. And as with the other games, I'm glad I'm able to share that, and not to mention in a video that doesn't make me cringe from the awful footage quality and angry ranting on others. I hope this new one didn't have that anyway. With that said, the video's done, and man did that turn out way longer than I was expecting. As usual. This was actually longer than my SA1 review, which is something I never thought would happen. I expected it to be maybe a 30-minute video tops, but nope. I ended up talking about it for well over an hour yet again, probably rambling and making no sense because I've once again stayed up until 3 a.m. writing this multiple nights in a row again. Go figure, huh? I guess I just can't shut the hell up. Regardless, we gotta move on again. You may think my next video covering Sonic will be in the era where things started to get dicey, which I would love to do, but as with the 1990s stuff, we're not quite there yet. There's still a few other games that were coming out during this era on Nintendo's newest handheld, the Game Boy Advance. Remember, I want to cover this series platformers, and as much as I'd like to jump straight into its next home console release, I wouldn't be doing my due diligence if I glossed over those handheld entries, because I think they have just as much of a right to be covered. Also, it gives me an excuse to play them, so yeah, why not? So with that said, feel free to join me next time for a look at all the GBA Sonic platformers, a few of which I'll actually be playing for the first time. That's all for me, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.
I won't go down that easy.
2 seconds later.
Defeated? Impossible!